Hello, and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm José.
And we're talking about Judas and the Black Messiah today, which is a film about Fred Hampton. Had you ever heard of Fred Hampton?
No.
I had, but he's not a name that most people are familiar with, and I didn't know that much about him. He's someone who comes up online as this kind of... Today I learned that after Martin Luther King and after Malcolm X, there was this other black civil rights leader who was shot and killed at the age of 21 in December 1969, a year and a half after Martin Luther King, and I think 4 years after Malcolm X. Only 21 years old, and it's amazing kind of what he achieved in that time. So he was this young civil rights leader and community organiser and activist in Chicago. And what the film dramatises, which I didn't know, is that he brought together organisations of different races into a rainbow coalition. And this is kind of one of the things that made J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, see him as such a threat. Because ultimately the story goes, although it's kind of never been proven exactly, because these things never are, that his death was an assassination at the hands of the FBI, but, you know, but they didn't come out and say, yes, of course we did.
I mean, the film definitely posits it as an assassination and offers its own kind of proof at the end. Yeah, because there was a civil lawsuit brought by the families and they won.
The film was directed by Shaka King. It stars Lakeith Stanfield as Bill, who is the rat, essentially, the FBI informant.
So he's not presented as a rat.
No, and he kind of becomes one. So he starts off as a car thief. In fact, he's dressing as an FBI agent to shake down black people and steal their car keys. And when he's caught by the FBI, having done this, he's offered this deal. The FBI agent is played by Jesse Plemons.
Who's wonderful.
Who's wonderful. And he has that real, you know, that thing that he has of you can't trust this guy. There's something shaky and weird about him. He's basically offered this, it's a Faustian bargain, right? Like, either you infiltrate the Black Panthers, which Fred Hampton is part of and leading in Chicago, or you go to prison. It's not really a deal he can say no to.
I think if that deal had been presented to him after he had full knowledge of what it really involved, he might have turned it down.
Sure, because at the start he's shown as just someone who's drifting, basically. He's asked by Jesse Plemons, did you feel bad about Martin Luther King's death, Malcolm X's death? He says, I haven't really thought about them, right? And I think there's a suggestion in there that like he's trying to think of what the right answer is for the agent, but also I think there's an element of truth in that, right?
Yeah.
Because what you see throughout the film is he learns what this organisation is, he learns what being part of an organisation like this means.
Yes.
And he ends up with kind of sympathy for it.
If I could just summarise my responses to the films, because I think it's a very interesting film. So my first thought was, you know, isn't it wonderful that we now are getting stories like this, right? And from a black point of view. Yeah, it is very much kind of, you know, a black perspective on these events, which I really welcome. And it was wonderful to see, like, you know, the clothes and the language, and Daniel Kaluuya was so charismatic. Yeah, so all of those things kind of, to me, become a pleasure. But then, kind of, I had doubts that seeped in. Yeah, like I think in some ways, you know, so the film has been really praised, and, you know, don't get me wrong, I really welcome, you know, this type of film. But I actually think that the film itself is not very good. Yeah, that kind of, it has, well, many aspects are very good. Yeah, but some key aspects are, to me, very problematic. And actually, they all revolve around the Lakeith Stanfield character.
Bill.
Because, you know, the film is about him.
Yeah, he's the central character.
Yeah.
And Fred, who's played by Daniel Kaluuya, is important, but not the main guy.
So the film is meant to be about Bill, but is really about Hampton. Yeah. And so what you have is all the narrative drivers are kind of focused on a half-baked character. Yeah, because actually I don't think you know enough about Bill. Yeah, kind of, what's his family? What's drawing him? You know, does he have a girlfriend? Does he have a partner? What are his desires? You don't know. Yeah, all you know, I mean, he's just almost like a necessary plot device. Yeah, kind of to look in on Hampton's story. Yet actually, everything about the film hangs on him and his actions. So he's really underdeveloped as a character, and yet he's the central one.
The thing about Bill posing as an FBI agent to steal cars is understood to be true sometimes, and also not. Like, there are various theories on where he came from and how he was got by the FBI and this sort of thing. So, like, there's an element of, he is this background free wild card, and that element didn't bother me. But what did bother me is what you said about what are his desires. Because although I think he starts off with no principles or understanding of what he's getting into, and he develops that, it's too basic, ultimately, the conflict within him. And still you don't really understand. I was thinking as well about The Departed, right? Because the rat story, the rat elements of the story, is obviously shared with that. And it made me think about how in The Departed, whenever you saw Leonardo DiCaprio with the mob guys, and whenever you saw Matt Damon with the police, you felt the intensity of the decisions they were having to make in the moment to keep their cover and all that kind of thing. You felt it every second, and you don't feel that here. There are scenes where you do. There are scenes like where they tell him to hotwire the car to prove that his story about that's what he used to do is true. But most of the time, he is just kind of getting along, and I don't feel the intensity I wanted from, or that I felt would be appropriate from that element of his story.
No, and I think, had the film truly been about Bill, and we would have known more of his life, his background, his sex life, his wishes, then we would have known more about his development, right? Which I don't think we got enough. So, you do have moments where, you have, it signaled a different awareness or, a reluctance to be involved, right? But, there's so much possibility there to show self-hatred and revulsion and need and being coerced and being cornered, right? Like, what is cornering him? Why doesn't he just upchuck and move to Canada or something, right? Like, he really, kind of doesn't. I mean, as far as we're concerned, he's kind of being forced to do this, but what the forces are that are cornering him, you don't really know. But also, I mean, to push it further, he knows, the people has he come to love these people? I mean, you definitely see a kind of a sense of fondness, right? But it would have been good to know what are now the degrees of fondness or affection for these people that he's now involved with in the Black Panthers. And does he not prefer to spend a year in jail than to have, let's say they have become friends, than to have all of the friends of his killed? I mean, there's never a moral or ethical or, a sense of shame or, he's not a character whose actions you get to understand, right? And that is the heart of the film. And I think if you don't understand that, then the film has a problem. Because actually you do know what drives Kaluuya, you do know what drives his partner, having a child. I think the politics are well explained. You know why these people are angry and joining the Black Panthers, and what's involved in it, and what kinds of organization they want. I mean, so I think the politics and all of that comes across really well. Kind of, I understand it, and actually some of the speeches and so on, you feel like this prickle because they move me. I find all that stuff like quite moving, really. But to me, the film doesn't work.
I agree with that. I felt there was something missing in that as well. I mean, it's very much a genre piece in that respect. It's this genre informant thriller that doesn't fill in all of the details kind of that it needs to. It relies actually on the genre to pull it through.
I don't understand the basic decision, because I think had this film been about Hampton, with the threat kind of being posed by the informant, or actually by one of many informants probably, then it would have had a different kind of life,
Maybe.
Because, I'm moved by the struggle, I'm moved by the culture. Kaluuya is so charismatic in the role, right? Like, that kind of what's at stake for him is so vivid. But actually, by putting the accent on the informant, I think it detracts from all of that whilst not adding anything, really.
Possibly, but I do think that it would have been very easy, had the informant been a secondary character, it would have been very, very easy to dehumanise him and make him into much more of like a cartoon villain. And actually the film doesn't do that. It doesn't. I don't think it fully rounds him enough, but it humanises him more than it otherwise would have, I think.
That's true, but it does. I mean, the accent here is on enough, right? Because I think you could have made more of that sense of humiliation, of control. I mean, you can use your imagination to think of how Bill is a kind of slave, right? And an Uncle Tom, and, and yet, he doesn't want to be. He's struggling against that. It's kind of, choices that forces, structural forces and organized forces, but outside of your control, corner you into ways of behavior that might repulse you, right? I think all of that could be a really interesting character if that had been the drama of the piece. Yeah, but I don't think it is.
No.
So,
it's a lack in the film, that's for sure. But I'm not convinced that structuring it with Bill at the centre on paper is the worst decision. I think that's an interesting decision, and I think you still get enough. You get so much out of Fred Hampton, and what he believes in, and actually how someone like Bill could become drawn into that, and the appeal of it and all that kind of stuff.
I don't like the story. If it had been Fred Hampton's story, it would have been a story of struggle and resistance and putting your life on the table, for people's freedom and well-being. It's a heroic story. It's a kind of a martyrdom, right? This is, again, I think, a different way of defeatism. Yeah, kind of, here's this rat informer, right, who, once he sees a television program about him, is so repulsed by himself that he commits suicide. I mean,
I don't know what you mean.
Well, kind of one... Socially, one is a story of heroism, right? And the other one is another story of defeat and suicide. Yeah.
Right, but I mean, do you think that we're with Bill? I mean, when it comes up at the end, that even after this... Because the thing is, you get to the end of this story, and he's poisoned Fred, which I think is something that is not established in historical fact, but it's a possibility. I think he was drugged, but it's not established that Bill did it.
Yeah.
But in the film it is. So he's poisoned him, he knows what's going to happen, he's given this blueprint of the house to the feds, so they know the layout of the place, they can come in and just kill everyone.
He murders them, basically.
So yeah, he's absolutely responsible. And at the end, he is crying his eyes out because he knows what he's done and what's going to happen.
Boo-hoo.
Right. Right, but that's the end of the story as it's filmed. And then in intertitles at the end of the film, it tells you that he went on, worked for the FBI for another 4 years or something, into the 70s, and made the equivalent today of $200,000 doing it. So you're like, well, if he felt that awful and broken up, as the film shows us, when he did that, how did he carry on doing it, right? So I'm not really with him when it says, oh, and then he killed himself. Like, I don't feel bad for that guy when he kills himself in 1990.
It's not that I feel bad for the guy, but it makes the story into a story of defeat, suicide.
The story is one of defeat. I mean, the film has ultimately been made, but Fred Hampton was murdered.
You can inflect defeat in different ways, right? Fred Hampton being murdered is a story of heroism. Kind of he was murdered fighting for freedom. It's different than you committing suicide because you realize you're a weasel.
I do kind of see what you mean, but I don't read it as that. I didn't take it as that. I didn't take it as that being the ultimate takeaway from the film.
Well, so let's focus now on things that are really good. So what I really liked about the film was Hampton's wife, Deborah, I think is her name.
Played by Dominique Fishback.
I think she's wonderful. And actually, I thought all of those things, because at the end of the film, you have some footage of Hampton speaking, right? And he's so handsome, and so charismatic. And actually, he looks much older than his 20, he's meant to be 20, 21, right? Mm-hmm. And then Kahlua is not handsome, in my view, yeah? But I thought it was wonderful casting. He and Dominique Fishback have such interesting faces. They're not like, kind of magazine pretty faces, yeah? They're like real people, and you get involved with them, and you find them beautiful through character in very interesting ways. I loved, the whole discourse of oppression and freedom and kind of, why it's important to organize and fight. And actually, it's shocking that this kind of rather feels amazing in an American kind of mainstream, relatively big budget film. Yeah, I think it cost 28 million.
I think what's interesting about the speechifying and the ideology and stuff, what's interesting about Hampton that comes across in the film is that he's so pragmatic about it. So actually what drives him, or at least from what he says, it really doesn't come across as ideological to me. When I think about films about Martin Luther King, and even actually Martin Luther King's actual speeches, right? I have a dream. It's this idealism or what could be. And I think when Fred Hampton goes to the whites leftist sort of with the Confederate flag up. So these guys aren't racist straight out, but they've got a Confederate flag up, and they say this thing, which is a very modern, or refers to a very modern
take,
discourse on the Confederate flag and how no, the Confederate flag isn't racism, it just reflects my heritage. And that's something we've been seeing with Confederate statues and things like that for the last few years in America very actively. And I think it's invoking that discourse very deliberately and knowingly. But Fred goes to see these people and he talks to them about culture. And there's a great thing about how if your house is on fire and you need water to put it out, someone asks you, what's your culture? My culture's water. And so would yours be. If you're starving, my culture's food, and so would yours be. All right. So this thing about actually, there's no it's what brings these people together is ignoring what he conceives of as more surface level ideas. What draws us together is poverty and basic needs, and I think you get this real feeling for why that was able to draw together groups of disparate races into something very strong. Which is something that I don't associate. That like I say, pragmatism is something that I don't associate with narratives around these other civil rights leaders so much. With Malcolm X, the kind of, I suppose, the traditional, if you like, sort of difference between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X is that Martin Luther King was about peace and Malcolm X was about violence. And there's obviously something very practical, in a sense, about violence. But this is different, right? This is about like putting aside differences and just aiming at actual practical solutions. I think that's interesting.
Well, it is interesting, though. I felt like some of the discourses, like he's given money to escape, right, and to go to Cuba or Algeria, and he says no, because with this money, we could build a medical center that'll save thousands of lives. My first thought is, what a fucking country is the U.S. That kind of can't afford healthcare for its people. That it has to become kind of, this kind of trade-off, right? And then it made me think that, all of these structural oppressions against such a huge percentage of its population, you wonder, why don't people organize and throw bombs? I mean, they should, in my view. If there's a basic kind of injustice, the police beatings and mass shootings and, just that absolute racism, this killing of a population, because of a difference of color in their skin, they should rise up, is my view. If you're thinking just logically, that's where logic leads you. Of course, you can't say those things publicly because, there's all these kinds of censorship involved, at kind of all levels, including like a personal one. You'll get in trouble if you say these things. But the film gives it as a kind of logic, really. And I think that's, to me, the value of the film. But also, it is ideal, so I think and I think you can't minimize, the value of, we need ideals, it's kind of, the idea of social justice is an ideal, it's not a reality, right? But it's definitely kind of things that kind of drive people to at least attempt to realize it. And I think you do see that as well in the film. I mean, there is a sense in the film that, so unlike what I'm talking about, the structure of the characters, I think actually the film has struck a very good balance in putting forth these ideals and actually having the anger there, but not making it the driving force, for Hampton. You don't know what drove him to be an activist. It could have been something terrible, right? But all you know is that, he's seeking social justice. Yeah.
And he conceives of it as a war, right? Which leads to that great bit where his girlfriend, who's pregnant at this point, kind of pleads with him to think about his child and the fact that if he continues the way he is, he'll be bringing his child into a state of war. That's kind of how he lives, and he thinks of every day as this continuing war, which is not ideal. And so I think you can see the idealism. Ultimately, he wants social justice, and he wants people to work together, and he wants his people to rise up and have a place and have rights and so on. But you so rarely see him speak about it in those terms, though. You do see him speak about it in like I say, practical terms, or this ongoing war, as opposed to something which has an end.
Well, we know for a fact that I mean, one of the things that you pointed out is how so many of the situations are really a commentary on the current conditions and what we've seen in the news over the last 2 years, right? So, these are discussions that are kind of culturally ongoing in the United States, and that the film is reflecting from another era, but that obviously rhyme and evoke kind of ours, right? So that in itself shows that the struggle is an ongoing one, right? Things haven't changed.
No, absolutely, but he doesn't speak of it. Maybe in the first speech, which I must say he speaks very quickly, and I didn't catch a lot of some of what he said. But he didn't seem to conceive of what he was doing as something that could have an end. Which is not to say that he wants it to go on, but he just conceives of it as something that will be ongoing. Which, for all the kind of pragmatism that I'm talking about, is in opposition to that, I think. Because for someone who I think comes across as pragmatic, you would think that would lead to a solution ultimately, or resolution, or something. I don't know. I'm not. I don't know. Maybe it's not the opposition that I think it is, or maybe it's interesting. I don't know.
Anyway, I wanted to say, that to me, the film offers very interesting discussion points. But as a film, and it has some wonderful performance. I think Haluya is amazing. As is the
Jesse Plemons. The FBI agent.
Yeah, I think they both really stand out and are wonderful. And I love the cinematography, actually, by Sean Bobbitt. I thought that was superb, actually. It's kind of beautifully lit and evocatively lit. The only dash of color that you get of brilliant color is actually that Confederate flag. It's quite amazing. But it's a film that offers a lot of really interesting conversation points, but that as a work of art, for me, it fails. And so I don't understand kind of.
I don't think it fails as much as The Five Bloods did, though, in that respect, which was much more didactic.
Yes,
about telling you what it thought and that sort of thing. This offers, actually, I think a lot of what this offers is the opportunity to see the story told of someone who deserves to have their story told and hasn't. I think there have been a couple of TV movies about Fred Hampton, a documentary, a book.
But you see, that makes me wish that the film had been about Fred Hampton.
No, I know what you mean, but it's not like he wasn't central. He just wasn't as central as Bill.
Well, he's not the central character. So, of course, he is, the next most important character, but kind of, I don't like the structure that this is really the story of the informant that got Fred Hampton killed. Yeah, I think it's a stupid mistake.
I think that's the way, and I think it's a film that probably would have been hard to get made if you hadn't structured it that way, because you structure it this way and it becomes this genre piece. And it becomes about the informant, and I think that's what gets you the money to make it.
I don't know. I mean, I think to structure it this way is a sellout, and it's a kind of a contribution to defeatism and failure and suicide. I don't like it.
It's not about defeatism. I mean, it is about defeat, but it's about, they eventually got this film made about Fred Hampton. Of course it was defeat. Fred Hampton was murdered. Assassinated.
No, but that's a heroic.
Right?
That's a heroic story.
Ish. He was murdered in bed. They broke into his house and murdered him in bed. It wasn't a heroic death.
It was, because actually it's his actions that led to that death. Yeah, it's his actions that led the FBI, and the state's attorney's office and so on to collude into murdering, a person. So it is a heroic death. It's what you did that kind of, the forces of the state kind of, kill you for, right? And what he did was an attempt at social justice. You can't not agree, with kind of what his aims were, right? So it's a heroic death. Being a weasel, is not a heroic death. And the story is about the weasel.
I don't sympathise with that point of view, really. I don't.
So we will...
The weasel is not a rich enough character. I completely agree with that. I felt the same thing. But I don't agree that the structure was a problem.
I think that's why the film fails. You never understand what is, de facto the central character. I would have liked to film directly about Hampton. But, you may be right. If you do it, it might never have been made, right? I mean, there is language and situations and, definitely, and the point of view. I mean, the point of view, is becoming more available. To have films from a black perspective is certainly not as unique as it was, kind of 30 years ago. So, but it's still wonderful to see. But actually, just some of the dialogue and the phrases, the quoting of Che Guevara, the talk about revolution, all of that stuff, you almost never see it in an American film. So, that is definitely to be welcomed. And that might also be, something that if the story had been directly about that, it might not have been made. So that I grant you as a possibility.
They snuck in all of that under the guise of The Departed.
But I think the film, would have been much more successful. It would have, addressed audiences more directly on a more emotional level if it had been clearer in its focus and if that focus had been on Hampton.
That may be true, but it's gone down extremely well. Yeah, so there's no denying that people are responding to it probably as it wants to be responded to and that sort of thing. And it's been Oscar nominated for Best Picture. So, yeah. There's a couple of small things that I liked. I think the title's great because it's a title that makes you think it's going to be this black pride, this great guy. And of course, there's an element of, the Black Messiah that's it is. But it's interesting that in the context of the film, Black Messiah, as a phrase, is used by J. Edgar Hoover. Played by Martin Sheen. So it's not this thing about this great guy who's going to come and unite everyone and blah, blah, blah. It's this thing about this guy that the FBI is scared of, terrified of, that this guy will emerge. That's interesting.
Can I interject here? Played very poorly by Martin Sheen. Yeah, who's wearing what looks like a plastic head, completely inexpressive, hiding his face, and yet doesn't offer much. It actually, I think, is a casting that detracts from the role. I would have preferred to have had somebody anonymous, rather than to have, Martin Sheen's very recognizable and rather flat voice come out of that mask.
He looks like Dustin Hoffman in Hook. To me.
Dustin Hoffman in Hook was a million times more interesting.
Yeah, but yeah. And the other thing was, I thought it was interesting. There are a few elements of mirroring in the film, and one of them is this one right at the start of Bill dressing as this FBI agent and then becoming one, right? And so he's undercover in two ways, opposite ways, early on. The other thing I noticed, which I liked, was the first speech you hear Fred give. He's been invited to a school, I think, that's been renamed Martin Luther King Junior High School or University, something like that. And he says, yeah, that's all well and good, but this isn't real for it, And he says, basically, and that's when he meets his future girlfriend, who says, I like your speech and everything, but maybe don't tell everyone that they're fucking wasting their time straight away,
Yes.
And then at the end, he's the one who says, take this money, build a medical centre with it, and name it after Jake, who's one of the guys who seems got in a fight with the police and died. Name it after him so that when people think of his name, they'll think of healing and health. And so this thing about naming, not important, becomes important to him.
You see, like in the film, if the film had been the Fred Hampton story as opposed to Judas. Anyway, we should wrap it up. So
I think it's a really good film. Yeah, entertaining, good to see. I don't really mind.
I think it's a mediocre film about an important issue with some very impressive performances and beautiful lighting and wonderful use of music.
And an important person.
Yes.
So the story deserves to be told.
Yeah, so I really recommend that people see it, though it'll lead to brilliant conversation, but don't expect a work of art. Thank you very much for listening. We are Eavesdropping at the Movies, and we are on
Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, and YouTube. On social media, we're on Facebook and Twitter at Eavesdrop Movies, and the website is eavesdroppingatthemovies.com.
Yes. And again, if you like, please retweet. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. It'll be a lovely help.
Yes.
I really appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And Kaluuya's casting, it's interesting that we haven't commented on that, because we've said he's brilliant, and he is brilliant, and I think he's just one of these greats. But, you know, he's 10 years older than...
And it's an issue.
He's 10 years older than Fred Hampton was, and he's English, and we've spoken before about English actors taking on these American roles, particularly black English actors taking on American roles, where the kind of cultural specificity of being black in America is not the same as being black in Britain. Was that an issue for you?
It wasn't. I mean, I did think about it.
Yeah.
I do think that there are just things that if you grow up in a culture, you just absorb and reproduce and know of, right? And there's only so much active learning that someone can do in a very short period of time to fill out a whole cultural history, and attitudes and, you know, ways of speaking and so on. So those two things did cross my mind. What I did think, actually, was that the film would have been, again, more interesting if it had been cast younger. Yeah, I don't know how old Kaluuya is.
He's 32.
32. And he looks 32, yeah. So I think if you had made this film about 20-year-olds, it would have been a very different kind of film. And I think, to me, a more interesting one, right? Because, I mean, I don't know how old the informant would have been there, but if he was around the same age, then kind of you're just coming out of adolescence and into adulthood, and you're black men, right, with all of that involves and related with the relations with the police, kind of, you know, young men.
He would have been 19 or so.
He would have been 19. You see, that becomes a whole other set of issues and much more understandable, and can, you know, brings in a different kind of drama, right, if it's played that much younger.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
the fear, actually, that a 19-year-old would have in that situation with the FBI informant, with the FBI agent.
Yeah, you know, with testosterone raging and things. I mean, I think it's a mistake.
You definitely don't feel it from either of them that they are the age they're supposed to be.
No.
No.